Brian Oliver presents Haunting Tales of Madness!
Charred, written by Brian Oliver, narrated by Glenn Hewson. The house burned for hours. It had been a charming farmhouse at one time. Now it was cinders and ash. Our belongings were gone. Our pet iguana was gone. Even our clothing. There was nothing left. It was hard to distinguish, but I could hear Carrie's screams above the sirens of the fire trucks. She never had a chance. She was my beautiful wife, and from the sound of her wailing, I knew the future in which I would be a widower was now imminent. It was about 2 a.m. when the smoke alarm went off. The fire had started in the back house and quickly rushed through the laundry room and into the main house. The curtains, carpets, furniture, all of it ablaze. I could hear Carrie screaming for help, but the flames were so high and thick that reaching her would not be possible. Her screaming had stopped before the fire truck made it to our driveway. The smell of burnt up everything, including flesh, filled my nostrils. I could not look at the house. All I could think was that it should never have been like this. There was a plan for our lives, and this was not how things were supposed to go. It was nearly 3 hours before the fire was completely out, and there was very little structure left. The upper floor collapsed and sent dust and debris flying into the air. I sat there trembling as the paramedic put a blanket on me. I was lost for what I felt like an eternity, staring at the ground. The fire marshal and police chief both approached me. They told me there was no way Carrie could have survived. It was another hour when I heard someone say they found her. Looking in their direction, I saw one of her charred arms sticking up from the rubble. It barely looked like an arm anymore. I know that law enforcement spoke to me more, but I was in such a daze that I couldn't quote any of what was said. The sun had begun to rise, and I could tell that for most, it was going to be a beautiful morning. The police escorted me to my friend Polly's house, even though truly I should not have driven in that state of mind. It was by the kindness of our small community that I wound up with clean clothes and hygiene products. My boss had contacted me and told me to take as much time as I needed. He was even generous enough to help me in replacing my cell phone, which was also taken by the flames. My friend Polly let me stay with him and told me that I could have my own room if I needed. He was never fond of having his friends just stay on the couch. While I was grateful for the soft bed, I was not having an easy time with this, and Polly seemed to think we were going to drink and laugh and have a good time. I stayed only one night. The last thing Polly said to me was that he was so very sorry that things had turned out so poorly. I haven't bothered to call him since. The next few weeks were like a hurricane in my head. Answering questions, planning Carrie's funeral, trying to keep her mother from having a full meltdown, and of course, dealing with insurance paperwork and the death certificate. I knew the process was not going to be a short one, but when the word arson came up, I had no idea what to say. Neither Carrie nor I had any enemies to speak of. I don't think she even had one coworker who didn't like her. I'm just an analyst, so I don't really get out much and haven't made anyone angry that I'm aware of. I didn't know what else to tell the police. Then they changed their focus and put their sights on me. I have to admit that, sure, there was some motive. It was to the tune of $3 million. I loved Carrie, and I know that should I have died first, she would have been left with the same amount. They tried to get me with hardball accusations and threats of telling me that other people would give details that showed me in a bad light. The officers and detectives really wanted a confession. They told me that they had heard Carrie and I been having a rough patch. They said my own mother sometimes thought we were harmful to each other. The joke is on them, though. My mother would never say that. She lives in a dementia ward and doesn't even know that she has a son. Sometimes I think cops are more worthless than anyone else when it comes to honest behavior. They never had enough to charge me with anything. It has been some 5 years now since the fire. I think about Carrie often. Yes, I did get the insurance money. That is why we have insurance. I did, however, have to move. We lived in a small town, and the rumor mill was just too much to fight with. I bought a small private estate in the middle of nowhere because I liked my peace and quiet. I can read by the fireplace for hours with no distractions. No one comes up to me to ask what really happened. No one calls me the guy who burned his wife. There is one bad side to living alone. Every crack and creak the house makes gives me a good jump. I'm not used to this much solitude. I have paid staff to run the house, but they don't stay at night. I know that makes me sound like a child. One night I woke up with the smell of smoke in my nostrils. It smelled just like the burning house had smelled, and then I smelled the burning of flesh. I swore it was just my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard the scream. I slowly turned my flashlight to shine down the hallway from outside my bedroom. I saw nothing, but I could still smell the smoke. I could still hear sounds of pain and anguish coming from an unknown source. It was very difficult to tell if these sounds were close or far away. It was hard to tell if they were being made by a male or female, or even if they were human. I shook and tried to maintain control as I moved slowly down the corridor. My flashlight washed along the walls. The dark wood of the hallway seemed to hide the real world in its shadows. I swallowed hard and felt the dryness in my mouth moving towards my throat. Then I felt a rush of hot air from behind me. I turned and aimed the flashlight. It was there for only a brief portion of a second, but I swear I saw the charred face of Carrie. Her flesh was black with lines of red in between the cracking flesh that was once her beautiful face. I could feel the heat coming off of her as she screamed into my face. I fell backward and realized too late that I was headed back first off the landing and then down the hardwood stairs. I rolled over and over, feeling my body and bones hit the edges of the stairs. It took only a few seconds, but felt like an eternity until I eventually hit the bottom floor and cracked my head against the last step. The doctor told me I was very lucky. I should have had a concussion, but I was walking away with just a few bruised ribs. He had also asked me how I got burned. This took me aback. I had not been burned, but then he pointed to my chest. There was the faintest burn on my chest. It looked almost like the shape of hands. This gave me a flashback to the visage of Carrie pushing me. There was no way that could have been real, though, could it? I quickly lied and told the doctor it was actually a childhood injury and brushed it off. It was difficult to get around the house, especially the stairs, until my ribs started to feel better. Showering was also difficult for a few days. Whenever the hot water hit the spot on my chest, it felt like when hot water hits a serious sunburn. Eventually, things went back to normal. I continued to work around the house and in the back garden. I learned a lot about cooking for myself and taking care of things around the house, but with Carrie gone, all of it was still hard. I had grabbed myself a TV dinner and was comfortable in the living room watching the news while I ate. The reporter was mentioning issues around North Korea, and then his co-anchor moved into a story about new findings in the case of Marilyn Monroe. Nothing too riveting, but they had a special report coming up after the break about items found that belonged to Joe DiMaggio and how valuable they would be. 2 museums were in a bidding war over the sports paraphernalia. After the news, I fell asleep in my chair. My little corgi, Dozer, took care of what was left of my dinner. When I woke up, the house was already in flames. The curtains were ablaze and my path to the front door was blocked. I looked down and saw Dozer was now little more than blackened remains. It was like my dog had been flash fried. The smoke detectors were singing their opera loudly as I looked for a way out. I ran for the back door and was nearly there as the ceiling started to buckle. It crashed down directly in front of my path. I looked for where I could possibly go and chose to run as fast as I could towards the hallway. As the walls and ceiling gave way, I felt like I was being herded towards the stairs. I should have trusted this feeling. Instead, I ran up the stairs, hoping to break out a window and jump to safety. As I ran toward the end of the hall, the flames began to circle around me. She stood in front of me. She was charred and smelt of burnt everything. Even her eyes were burnt and spoiled. Pustules started to ooze as she stood there. I gasped and readied myself to run past her. Her movements were unnatural and fast. She grabbed me and shrieked while throwing me through the doorway to the master bedroom. I fell off the side of the bed. When I looked up, she was already there, standing over me. She grabbed my throat and lifted me up. Shrieking loudly, she looked deep into my eyes. I tried to beg. I didn't start the fire. She looked at me with anger across her face. Her hands began to slowly warm up against my throat and chin. You had help. Carrie pointed at the television in the bedroom and it turned itself on. The news was still playing, but it was a story about a man back in our hometown. The man had been arrested for arson and was found burned to death in his jail cell. She looked back at me. I knew she recognized him to be Polly. Polly had been a friend of mine for years. He always has some new scheme he was working on, and for the most part, I just humored him. His idea for a quick return insurance scheme was just too tasty to ignore. Why the fuck did I let him talk me into it? From the look on Carrie's charred face, I knew that she understood what had happened, and it made her a furious spirit. All for money? She began to look like herself before the fire destroyed her. She looked like the woman I fell in love with. You let me die for money, didn't you? I choked up and began to really feel the pain coming from her hands. I'm so sorry, Carrie. He promised you wouldn't get hurt. The money was for our future. I have punished him. Now, my love, I have to punish you. I clawed at her arms, holding me, but it was to no avail. I could see in her eyes the pain of my scheming and dishonesty. I may not have started the fire, but I set the plans for it into motion. Carrie knew it all along. I guess you can't lie to a ghost, can you? She screamed as her visage began again to change into the hideous charred husk I had seen in the remains of our house. I could see bones and muscle tissue from broken skin. I could see blood running out of her body. Worst of all, I could see her eyes melting away as they were replaced with a dark, fiery void that oozed liquid flames. The last thing I felt was my neck igniting as Carrie screamed into the night. The fire took the entire estate. My body didn't even have enough pieces left to bury. Be careful playing with matches. There's a good chance you'll get burned.